I cannot but think you rose in standing ovation in part due to Mr. Rusher's eloquence and in equal part due to the enormous dignity of my predecessors. I feel a bit outgunned to follow first Ronald Reagan, then George Bush, Bill Bennett, Mrs. Thatcher, Dan Quayle, General Powell. I am only encouraged in my undertaking this evening when I think of the 6 or 8 invisible great men that stand behind me, the ones I have explored. They have taught me a great deal. I am also very much cognizant of the honor of following in such a distinguished company to speak to this distinguished audience, to both the university and the Ashbrook Center, is a significant achievement for me and one I won't soon forget. And I must also again thank my old friend and mentor, Bill Rusher, for the generosity and eloquence of his introduction. It's common for people with public faces to be introduced with the simple declarative sentence, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, a man who needs no introduction." Believe me, you can always use a good introduction. No. And I got one. But you laughed at that, but it's true. I have a story to tell you that proves it. It didn't happen to me. This happened to a friend of mine, Kirk Douglas. And when Ben-Hur was in release in theaters more or less all over, Kirk told me he was walking in the street near his home in Beverly Hills, and a stranger stopped him, most politely, and said, "Excuse me, sir, I don't like to interfere in the private lives of public people, but I cannot let pass this opportunity to tell you what a deeply moving and incredibly creative performance you gave in Ben-Hur." And Kirk said, "Well, thanks very much, but that wasn't me, that was another fella." And the man stood back amazed. He said, "Well, if you aren't Burt Lancaster, who the hell are you?" So I'm very glad that Bill Rusher also made it perfectly clear that I'm not Burt Lancaster. It's certainly true that there have been quite a lot of them. The resonances of that role, along with some of the others I've played, seem to echo around me permanently, I guess, by now. I remember when my son, Fraser, was in preschool. He must have been 4 years old. And they had a custom every few days in this school that one of the pupils would be called to stand before his classmates and explain to them what his father did for a living. And Fraser strode up and stood for a moment in thought, and then he said, "My daddy pretends to be people." Which about covers it, I guess. And the distinguished achievements of many of those people are my best excuse for joining my distinguished predecessor at this specific podium, speaking to this specific audience. There certainly have been several of them. Prophets from both the Old and the New Testament, a couple of Christian saints, generals of various centuries and different nationalities, several kings, 3 American presidents, a French cardinal, and 2 geniuses, including Michelangelo. No, it looks fine the way it is. Please understand, I don't mean to be boastful. It's just that all these different fellows are crowding behind me, and I'm never certain which one of them gets to talk. I spoke to my daughter about that this morning on the telephone in New York, and I told her I'd be talking to you tonight, and she had some firm advice for me. My daughter often has firm advice for me. She's a very bright, cool-headed young lady. I very much value her opinion. This morning she said, "Don't talk too long. Don't tell any funny stories about me when I was a baby. And don't tell them how it was when you were a boy in the Depression." So, in conclusion, I would like to... No, happily I have other guidelines than those provided by my daughter to explore what I might say to you. Indeed, given the traditions of Ashland and Ashbrook, there is only one choice to make because of the diligence with which all of you, faculty, leaders, and students, and alumni, the diligence with which you pursue excellence. This is evident from everything published here, talking to any of the people that are here. I've talked often to Bill about this. That's one of the things that makes you so distinctive, your two institutions. And you can really discuss nothing else but excellence in a school and a center with your agenda. I won't tell you how it was when I was a boy in the Depression, because most of you know. Some of you indeed are even old enough to remember. I will remind you that among the many things that were different then was that most Americans, like my dad, had poorer jobs, less well paid than now, that left them and him a shorter life, less liberty and less chance for the pursuit of happiness those wise old dead white guys that made up this country promised to us all. Remember, the founding fathers did not promise us happiness, just the chance to chase it. Today, indeed, our lives are longer and healthier, our liberties perhaps a little less secure than they were then. The greatest change, I think, is in our growing preoccupation with the last of those shining goals, the pursuit of happiness. We now pursue pleasure, which is not the same thing. We often confuse the two. We chase pleasure so urgently that all else seems disposable. Truth, justice, right and wrong, good and evil, responsibility, courage. All these things seem at risk today. Do your best, keep your promises, my dad used to say to me. Now it seems the advice would be likelier to be, look, if it feels good, go for it, so long as it's politically correct. The chaplain of the United States, Richard Halverson, put it well, I think. We demand freedom without restraint, rights without responsibility, choice without consequences, pleasure without pain. In our narcissistic, hedonistic, masochistic, valueless preoccupation, we are becoming a people dominated by lust, avarice, and greed. The ethical foundations of Western civilization truly now seem to some as having perhaps outlived their usefulness, their purpose. I read in the LA Times not long ago that some serious geneticists are now inclining to the belief that much of what we've understood for thousands of years as failings in the human condition, these things are in fact genetically imprinted in us at birth. Wife beating, obesity, alcoholism, theft, even murder, as was demonstrated a couple of days ago in the Los Angeles County Courthouse. We're responsible for none of these. None of these things is our fault. Just think how that frees us. We're now responsible for nothing. There is no good nor evil. Man no longer is burdened with free will. As Thomas Jefferson once observed, when I consider that God is just, I tremble for the Republic. One of the most, let's wait. Let's examine this, though. If we do, why do we now dismiss the importance of justice, question whether there is a difference between good and evil? Why do we yearn to be responsible for no choices in our lives except our favorite flavor of ice cream? Is it the schools, the media, the movies, our leaders? I don't know. I don't know. But I believe I can best examine it through the men I know best, the ones I've played. Some of them have been remarkable. They all devoted their lives to the pursuit of excellence. I think we can learn something from them. Lord knows I did. One of the most remarkable of these was the man I just quoted, one of those three presidents I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson. He's generally recognized as the only genius ever to occupy the White House. During the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy invited several dozen of the most prominent scientists in the country to a luncheon in the East Room. There were Nobel laureates, every one. And he said to them, "Surely there has never been such a concentration of human brain power in this room since Tom Jefferson ate here alone." One of his biographers summed it up even more succinctly. He could break a horse, he said, shoot a squirrel at 50 paces, tie an artery, run a surveying line, dance a minuet. He also wrote the Declaration of Independence. By any measure, Thomas Jefferson was a great man. I think that's a good enough guide for us tonight. Okay, let us consider great men. I know there are great women too, but I don't get to play them. I saw her raise her eyebrow when I said that. I must point out, great men are an endangered species. Indeed, in the minds of many, they are less than that. They are mythic creatures that never really existed, like the unicorn. It's even been suggested, seriously, that greatness is in itself somehow inappropriate, certainly undemocratic. We live, after all, in the century of the common man. I know, but I believe in the uncommon man, maybe because I've played so many of them. Great men are suspect today, perhaps because we don't happen to have any of them around. We have good men. We have gifted men, brilliant men. God knows we have plenty of famous men. That's not the same thing. Anyone can be famous, and the famous are like anyone. Andy Warhol, the late Andy Warhol, said that we live in a time when absolutely anybody can be world famous for 15 minutes. But men like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Thomas More, Richelieu, Mark Antony, and Michelangelo are not like anyone. Believe me, they're not. They're not ordinary like you and me. They are extraordinary, and they have shaped the world. Such men shape the world, move it, not only by what they do in it, but by what they tell us about it. Winston Churchill, surely one of the few certifiably great men of this century, moved the world not only by what he did in it, but by what he told us about it. He inspired the free world at the depth, the nadir of our hopes for victory in World War II, not just by his leadership, but by his eloquence, which was often shatteringly simple. Somehow he was persuaded during this dark time to put aside his heavy burdens and return to Harrow, the boys' school he'd attended, and give the commencement address. Since he was the outstanding orator of the century, it was assumed he would give them some lastingly valuable advice. He did. After an appropriate introduction, He strode to the front of the platform, put his hands on his hips, and looked down at the upturned sea of shining, boyish faces. "Never give up," he said. "Never give up. Never, never, never give up." Just that, nothing more. If I had Churchill's courage, or perhaps even if I just thought of it myself, I would be tempted to leave you with that this evening. I'm sure none of the boys who heard Churchill that day has ever forgotten what he said, though perhaps not many have been able to follow his example. Today we live in a changed world, a world profoundly altered from those stubborn, stirring times. Only a few weeks ago, we heard dark voices rising. The President of the United States said, "We must beware of funk." Okay, I guess funk is, we mustn't fall into a funk, I think was his point. I hadn't planned to, but I'm certainly glad to be warned about it from the White House. That's mean. I couldn't resist that. It is true that we hear dark, anxious voices on every hand, admonishing us that we must lower our expectations. Accept reality, they say, and they paint it for us in ever bleaker colors. I have news for them. The world is still a tough place, a dangerous place. True enough, we live in the real world. We must know its real shape to thrive or even to survive in it. All right. One of the most realistic appraisals of the human condition I know was made by another great man. Of all the thousands of men, saints and sages, tyrants, clowns, that have ruled other men since history began, surely one of the most extraordinary was the Emperor Hadrian. He ruled the Roman Empire when that empire stretched from Scotland in the North Sea to the Sudan near the equator, and from Poland almost in Asia to Portugal on the Atlantic. And throughout all that vast realm, the Roman peace prevailed. A peace, let me remind you, that lasted longer than any the world has enjoyed since that time. That world was a harsh and dangerous one, like the one we live in. But Hadrian ruled it well and wisely, I think, because he knew something of the human condition, and he could face what he found there. He wrote something once in a letter to a friend that impressed me so much I committed it to memory. He said, "It is not true that I despise men. If I did, I should have no right or no reason to try and govern them. I know men. I know them to be vain, ignorant, greedy, cruel, cowardly, capable of almost anything for the sake of their own profit or increasing their own esteem, even to themselves. I know because I am like them, at least from time to time, or might have been." One of the most important things about that comment is that it's a lesson learned from history. If you can't remember history, said Santayana, you are doomed to repeat it. I agree completely. I'm convinced history is not only the most important subject, it may be in the end the only subject. Now, I'm prejudiced, of course, I'll admit that. History has given me some of my best parts. And the study of history has equipped me for many of the others. You see, even if the character you're playing is fictional, you still have to make the time in which he lived and the people around him as real as you can by learning about it. Judah Ben-Hur is a good example of that. He never really existed, of course. He's a fictional figure born from the fertile imagination of General Lew Wallace. A pretty extraordinary fellow himself, by the way. But the background reading I did for Ben-Hur taught me a great deal about first century Rome and Judea, about what it was to be a Jew in a hostile world, the impact of Christ's ministry on that world, and of course about chariot racing. Oh, you laugh. Yes, I understand. Of all those subjects, that last seems the least profound, huh? Knowing something about chariots, even how to drive one, doesn't seem permanently useful, huh? Wrong. It was. I haven't driven a four-horse chariot since the summer we spent shooting that race, but I learned something from it I have never forgotten. I learned it from Yakima Canutt. When he was a young man, Yak had been the best stuntman there was, a legendary figure. He invented stunting as a profession. On Ben-Hur, he was responsible for directing the race. He was also responsible for me. He taught me to drive the chariot over some 5.5, 6 weeks of daily effort in 2 or 3 hour sessions. And finally, as we were sitting one day, resting those white horses in the heat and resting the driver too, something occurred to me. And I turned to Yak, I said, you know, I can drive this chariot now. I know I can. I'm comfortable, I'm confident I can do it. But we've been out here by ourselves, just the four horses and you and me in the chariot. I said, we're going to start shooting this thing in 10 days. And there will then be 7 other chariots out here too. That will be a different proposition, and I'm not so certain I can handle that. Yak looked at me and he said, Chuck, you just make sure you stay in the chariot. I guarantee you're going to win the damn race. No, I know. The world is not a movie. There are no guarantees, not of winning, not even of surviving. But one thing is surely true. You got to stay in the damn chariot, huh? Of course, of all the great men I've had the good fortune to play, the most towering, both in the record of his life and in his impact on human history, was Moses. Lawgiver to the Jews, warrior prophet of Islam to Muslims, first among the prophets to Christians, the man of whom Christ said, if ye believe Moses, so shall ye believe me. In a very real sense, playing Moses marked my life. To play any man, any great man, is of course a daunting undertaking. But to play Moses is to feel yourself a tiny little figure, struggling, stretching inside the figure of a giant, trying somehow to fill the awesome hole he cuts in the sky. We began shooting that movie at the monastery of St. Catherine's on the lower slopes of Mount Sinai. It is the oldest Christian monastery in the world. It contains the shrine of the burning bush, where Moses heard the voice of God speak to him from the fire. During the Crusades, 9 centuries ago, Christian knights on their way to Jerusalem to retake that city from the Muslim hosts rested in perfect safety in that monastery on that mountain because they knew that Moses was also honored by Muslims and that the Muslims would never attack the shrine of Moses. In our own time, this same truce has held between Jew and Arab on that mountain only through 2 generations of conflict. That's how far the shadow of the man Moses reaches. And he was a man. Remember that. None of the 3 religions that reveres him calls him divine. He was a man and flawed as all of us. I think one of the reasons he speaks to us all so strongly across the centuries is that he speaks for brotherhood. All men are brothers, we're told, but I think that's a condition that thrives best, perhaps thrives only, in times of stress desperate danger. The men who fought in the Persian Gulf were brothers, regardless of rank, race, or condition. Shakespeare, who knew more of the human heart than any man who ever lived, had an English king say to a tiny band of his countrymen, facing what seemed inevitable defeat by an overwhelming French army, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. This day shall gentle his condition." Pretty good writer, wasn't he? The instinct for freedom. Moses stood for something more important than freedom, more important than brotherhood, and that was liberty. For 25 centuries, Moses has inspired those who search for liberty. It's no coincidence that the first tide of our Protestant forefathers in New England bore the names of the Exodus: Moses and Aaron, Joshua, Abraham, Isaac. Generations of black American men bore those same names, first searching for freedom in this country, then celebrating it. Those same names are cut in the edge of the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The words Moses spoke as he watched his people cross over Jordan, free at last. Go, proclaim liberty throughout all the lands, unto all the inhabitants thereof. The instinct for freedom seems to be part of the human condition, doesn't it? Like the knee-jerk. But history has a long perspective, and freedom is fragile. I remember coming back after 3 years overseas in World War II, in the sunny morning of victory. It seemed that freedom was floating on a rising tide then. We thought of it spreading around the world. We did. A world free of tyranny and war. We were wrong. It was tyranny that triumphed for 40 years. You know, the revisionist historians would persuade you otherwise, but it is important to remember it was an evil empire, there was a Cold War, and we won. Even now, with the Soviet tyranny a nightmare memory, we still see good governments go rotten, patriots turn to dictators. Democracy does seem to be staggering towards birth in Eastern Europe. Whether it can succeed in Russia is still open to question. Did you see there was an item in one of the news magazines, nearly a month ago, about a statue of Karl Marx, a 25,000-pound statue of Karl Marx on a granite plinth in a small square in Moscow. And they haven't taken it down, even though he is discredited, because they haven't figured out how to dismantle it in that small square. They have, however, altered the inscription cut in the granite on the base of the statue, which is his most famous quotation: "Workers of the world, arise." They've crossed out the last word and substituted this: "Workers of the world, forgive me." Nevertheless, in Cuba, China, North Korea, countries in Africa, in Asia, the world still sees the bloody face of the bear. In Azerbaijan, Tiananmen Square, a few years ago in Kuwait, where we achieved one of the most overwhelming military victories in history. In Somalia, where our Marines imposed peace on that bloody, ravaged, benighted land, largely by the implicit power of their presence. They were there. I was there too, as it happened, briefly. I saw this. Earlier, I was in the the rest camps in the Afghan border where the Mujahideen would come for rest and relaxation, regrouping, before going back into their own country to shoot down Soviet helicopters with Stinger missiles. I was in Beirut only days after a terrorist truck bomb killed 241 U.S. Marines. I went several times to Vietnam over 3 years as our troops slogged on there in increasingly bitter frustration. As a nation, we've fought 2 major wars in Europe in this century, wars we had no wish to fight, yet knew we must fight and must in the end win, and we did both. Now we stand on the brink of yet another bold venture in the Balkans, that eternal cooking kettle of conflict. I don't think any of us knows exactly what we should do there, how to do it, whether to rely on high-altitude airstrikes or fighter bombers at low levels, or U.S. soldiers taking the real estate block by block with blood and bayonets. But if we move, our history will inform us why. In the darkest days of our Civil War, far bleaker time than any we've known as a nation since, Abraham Lincoln put it best, as Abraham Lincoln very often did. With firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, we must finish the work we are in. We do it because it's right. As a country, we still believe in that, in doing right, doing good. We're maybe the only nation in the world that still believes in that. It's been said that the invention of the United States was the greatest single political act in the history of mankind. How did that happen? What brought about that extraordinary confluence of time, place, circumstance, the concerted effort of a people in arms and a few great men? The American experience. So far, it seems the most successful, huh? Now, of course, to history, the small 2 centuries of our little experiment in freedom, it's nothing, it's an eye blink. But we're still here. We may not have been able to make democracy spread, but we have made it prosper. This country is still what we've been from the beginning, an example to the world. Men can live free. In America, democracy works, not as well as we need it to work in these bleak, benighted times, but we are still to the rest of the world the shining door to freedom. Now why? Why is this? Our system? Well, surely that's part of it. The American dream, which is not success, but freedom. It's not that alone, though. Other countries have cherished that dream and lost it. Well, what then? Are we smarter? More determined? Is it luck or the grace of God? I think it's in part the land itself, that broad swell of continent between those shining seas. From the very beginning, before we were Americans as a people, we belonged to the land. We belonged to the land before the land was ours, Carl Sandburg wrote. Yes, that's true. And in all that time, our writers, our philosophers, our thinkers, our painters have tried to capture this for us. And I was thinking what I might say to you tonight. I turned to a file I have of significant phrases or sentences or even short paragraphs written or spoken by extraordinary Americans over the last 200 plus years. And shuffling through them, it occurred to me how easy it would be to let them fall into a single paragraph, even though the observations were made by very disparate men in very disparate times. The men whose words I chose, I put together the paragraph, are Martin Luther King, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Tom Paine, Samuel Eliot Morrison, William Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe, and Abraham Lincoln. You will all be able to connect one or two of the phrases with the man who spoke or wrote it. I don't think you can get them all, but I think you will agree that the paragraph seems to be one voice, the American voice. I have a dream. I refuse to accept the end of man. I believe he will endure. He will prevail. Man is immortal, not because alone among God's creatures he has a voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. About America and Americans, this is particularly true. It is a fabulous country, the only fabulous country where miracles not only happen, they happen all the time. As a nation, we have perhaps uniquely a special willingness of the heart, a blithe fearlessness, a simple yearning for righteousness and justice that ignited in our revolution a flame of freedom that cannot be stamped out. That is the living, fruitful spirit of this country. These are the times that try men's souls. The sunshine patriot and the summer soldier will in this crisis shrink from service, but he that stands and bears it now will earn the thanks of man and woman. We must bind up the nation's wounds with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us finish the work we are in. I repeated Abraham Lincoln's line. I thought it deserves it. One of the writers I quoted, Thomas Wolfe, in his novel of Time in the River, expanded this theme in a passage about the land that's, I think it's as good as anything I know in that subject. I make my living with other wiser men's words. Let me leave you tonight with Thomas Wolfe's of Time in the River. It begins with the sentence I quoted he wrote in that paragraph. It's a fabulous country, the only fabulous country. The one place where miracles not only happen, they happen all the time. It's the place of exultancy and strong joy, the place of the darkened, brooding air, the smell of snow. It's the place of all the fierce, the bitten colors in October, when all the wild, sweet woods flame up. It's also the place of the cider press and the last brown oozings of the York Imperials. It's the place where the great boats are baying at the harbor's mouth, great ships putting out to sea, boats blowing in the Gulf of Night, where the river, the dark and secret river, full of strange time, is forever flowing past us to the sea. It's the place of autumnal moons, hung low and orange at the frosty edges of the pines, the place of frost and silence, of the clean, dry corn shocks, and the opulence of the enormous pumpkins that ripen in the hard, clotted earth. It's the place of this stirring, feathery stumble of the hens upon their roosts. It's the place of this barking dogs, the great barn shapes and solid shadows in the running sweep of the moon-whited countryside, the wailing whistle of the night express. It's the place of the wild and exultant winter's morning, when the wind's been howling all night long. The snow piled on the branches of the spruce and hemlock. It's the place where the Fall River boats are tethered to the wharf and the wild snow whips across them. It's the place of the lodge by the frozen lake and the sweet smell and amorous flesh of woman. It's the place of the tragic, lonely beauty of New England, the red barns, the tatters of the old circus posters, the sound of the stabled horses. It's the place of the immense and pungent smell of breakfast, the country sausages, the ham and eggs, the smoking wheat cakes and the fragrant coffee, and the lone hunters in the frosty thickets who whistle to their lop-eared hounds. It is the immense and lonely and abundant land where they grow cotton, corn, and wheat, and the wine-red apples of October. It is the place that is savage and cruel, but it is also the innocent place. It is the wild, lawless place, the vital earth soaked with the blood of the countless murdered men, with the blood of the unremembered, unavenged, murdered men. But it's also the place of the child and laughter, where the young men are torn apart with ecstasy and cry out in their throats with joy, where they hear the howl of the wind and the rain and smell the thunder and the soft, numb spitting of the snow, where they're drunk with the bite and sparkle of the air and mad with the solar energy, where they believe in love and victory and think that we can never die.